how do we get those with power to listen to us and take our community's experiences seriously? And a critical part of the answer is we produce data to substantiate our claims. Credible, aggregated data that says this is not a one-off incident. This amounts to a pattern of systematic human rights violations. This amounts to the failure of the rule of law. And so I would say at Outright, we have a symbiotic relationship between the research we undertake and the advocacy strategies we pursue, because it's very hard to advocate to decriminalize homosexuality or abolish so-called cross-dressing laws or to ban conversion practices if you don't have data to show the way those laws harm people. And so research, whether it's by us or by wonderful partners like the Williams Institute, literally informs everything that we do.
And, you know, talking about how data is important to, you know, influence decision makers or to make more persuasive cases, have you found that there are certain kinds of data or ways of using data that are, you know, more or less effective in trying to have an impact on law and policy?
That's actually a hard question,
Yeah.
because all credible data is useful, but there's different kinds of data that you need for different kinds of advocacy targets. So I just did an interview this morning, and the thrust of that interview was actually in the value of strategic use of personal testimonials. And I think personal testimonials are essential when contextualized in a larger pattern, because it's the personal stories that convey to the reader that we're not speaking about something that's abstract. We're actually talking about the harm done to an individual. And it can be through the story of a student kicked out of school or a lesbian forced to go through forced marriage that suddenly makes the reader or the listener think, oh my God, this is happening to a real person. You know, it doesn't sound fair, and it invokes a sense of compassion. The data that we're drawn to most at Outright is aggregated data. And specifically, we focus on the production of multi-country data that demonstrates global trends. And the kinds of trends we've tried to document are things like whether or not LGBTIQ organizations have the right to legally register, or how prevalent so-called conversion practices or so-called conversion therapy is worldwide, or what impact COVID-19 is having on LGBTIQ people. Governments have a long history of rejecting data from civil society. And it's a struggle that we fight against. You know, Outright did a global report on what's popularly known as conversion therapy, but we call conversion practices because it's neither therapy nor therapeutic, but torture. And we met with government officials in Nigeria because we had a significant data set of survivors from Nigeria. And they said, why would we accept this global survey? It's not produced by a Nigerian organization. And we said, well, as a matter of fact, a Nigerian organization is our partner, and they will be releasing their own independent data set this year. But, you know, a significant number of respondents spoke out from Nigeria. So there's data that you should take seriously in what we already have produced and vetted and has undergone, you know, the highest standards of scrutiny. When I hear the government of Nigeria say, yes, but what I immediately think is our data will never be good enough for you. And so we need more data, we need more partners, we need to present data that is both impeccable in its credibility and profuse in its sources. So data from Nigerian organizations, both queer and mainstream, data from Global North and Nigerian academic institutions, data from the UN or African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Like, it is very hard to persuade those who are homophobic or transphobic that our data is credible. And often they will seek to discredit it regardless of its validity. The answer, of course, is not to give in to their arguments. The answer is to figure out what data they're likely to listen to, who is the source, and to focus on producing that kind of data. And I think one of the mistakes civil society organizations can make is sometimes we don't do a research assessment of our target before we undertake the data investigation. So a really big mistake, for example, would be to produce data without talking to the government officials about the kind of information that's going to be persuasive to them. And in Outright's experience, if you can do that preparatory research, if, for example, we want to change a sodomy law in a country, and you go and speak with government officials and they tell you, well, the reason we need a sodomy law is because we actually don't have a law that prohibits rape. And if we get rid of the sodomy law, then sexual violence will be permitted. That immediately tells you we need very specific advocacy recommendations and we need a very specific research project. It's not all about how sodomy laws lead to HIV prevalence or labor market discrimination. It should actually be a research study that specifically shows how sodomy laws encourage rape because they make it impossible to differentiate between consent and assault.
One of the things that the Williams Institute has done historically is kind of look at those shifts in public opinion and social attitudes to see how countries have been changing and how people are viewing sexual and gender minorities around the world. And I wonder, to what extent public opinion data and sort of research on public attitudes has played a role in the way that Outright sort of thinks about its advocacy.
Well, let me just seize the opportunity to say how valuable I think the Williams Institute is and how much I value you, both for the data that you produce and also for the partnerships that you offer. And I know that in Outright's eyes, you're a wonderful partner, and we look forward to many future projects with you, especially now that you're in your position, Ari. I think in terms of the specific question you asked about public opinion data, I think it is useful and it's very complicated because what it can do is it can convey a sort of hierarchy of nations, wherein these are the good, tolerant nations and these are the bad, oppressive nations. And we hear this from the media all the time. I got an email today from someone who was describing a specific country as one of the worst places on earth to be gay. And I really chafe against those interpretations of data. I don't think that's what any of us who are experts in the field are trying to say, because every country that fails to live up to its human rights obligations is the worst place on earth for you if you live there as an LGBTIQ person who's deprived of rights. But where the public opinion data can be really helpful is especially where it shows higher levels of tolerance and acceptance than you see in legislation. And I think that's sort of the sweet spot with public opinion data, because a lot of elected officials, unfortunately, are more worried about their next campaign than about serving the most vulnerable. But when you have that amazing data that says 51% or more of the population would live next door to an LGBTIQ person, or 51% or more people think violence against an LGBTIQ person is wrong, I think that often gives the protection to the elected officials, the members of parliament that we depend on to pass good laws and policies, to do the right thing. So I think some of the data Williams has produced in that spirit has just been excellent.